Hey guys, tonight we are going to embark on a journey back to a time when artificial light was a flickering candle. Silence was broken only by the scratch of a quill and ink. Well, ink wasn't just ink. Tonight we delve into the surprisingly complex, occasionally smelly, and undeniably fascinating world of medieval scribes and their quest for one of the most prized colors in existence. Imagine, just for a moment, that you are huddled over a desk in a cold stone room, the only warmth coming from a brazier spitting embers nearby. The air is thick with the scent of drying parchment, melted wax, and something else, something a little fishy. Maybe you dip your quill, not into a pot of simple black goo, but perhaps something far stranger, something that came from the sea, specifically from the humble, slow-moving, and perhaps slightly bewildered snail. Yes, you heard that right. Snails. For ink? It sounds like something out of a fever dream, doesn't it? A truly bizarre historical footnote that feels tailor-made for drifting off to sleep? You probably won't survive this level of historical minutia without at least a few yawns. But let's give it a shot. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always wild to see how far these sleepy history lessons travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself sitting, or perhaps kneeling, at a simple wooden desk tilted just so, designed to catch the scant light filtering through a high, narrow window. This is a scriptorium, a room dedicated entirely to the painstaking task of copying texts. It's not glamorous work. Hour after hour, day after day, your hand cramps around the quill. Your eyes squint at the faded or sometimes smudged letters before you. The silence here is profound, broken only by the rhythmic scritch, scritch of dozens, maybe even hundreds, of quills moving across treated animal skins. Yes, parchment. Forget paper, that's a later luxury for the masses. You're working with the carefully prepared hides of sheep, goats, or calves, stretched, scraped, and smoothed until they are ready to receive the sacred words of scripture, philosophy, or history. It's an expensive canvas, and the ink you apply to it must be equally worthy. Most of the time, your ink is a straightforward affair, at least by medieval standards. Gall nuts, those weird lumps that grow on oak trees when wasps lay eggs in them, are steeped or boiled, perhaps mixed with iron salts, often from rusty nails. Because recycling and a binding agent like gum arabic from acacia trees, this gives you a serviceable black or brown ink. Red ink often comes from mineral pigments like cinnabar or ochre, or maybe ground insects like kermes. Blues and greens have their own sources, often plant-based or mineral too. But then there's purple. Ah, purple. It's not just a color here, it's a statement. It screams wealth, power, divinity. It's the color of emperors, of kings, of God himself in some illuminated manuscripts. And obtaining this particular shade, this vibrant, almost impossibly rich purple, is where things get truly interesting, and frankly, a little bizarre. You see, while other colors could be derived from reasonably accessible plants or minerals, a truly spectacular, light-fast purple was notoriously difficult to achieve. This is where our humble sea snails come into the picture. Long before the medieval period, in the ancient world, people had discovered a secret hidden within certain species of marine mollusks, specifically the murex snails. These little sea dwellers contained a substance that, when exposed to air and light, underwent a magical, smelly transformation into the most coveted dye of the ancient, and eventually, the medieval world Tyrian purple. Life in the scriptorium isn't just about copying, it's also about preparing your materials. You might even be involved in the less than pleasant task before the writing begins. Remember that joke about medieval hygiene? Well, let's just say some processes involved. Bodily fluids, For instance, preparing parchment often involved soaking hides in vats, sometimes using stale urine to help remove hair and flesh, and certain ink recipes might have called for it too as a solvent or a binder. So you might be sitting there, quill in hand, sniffing the faint tang of processed animal skin and yesterday's regrets while contemplating the divine text you are copying. It gives you a new appreciation for ballpoint pens, doesn't it? Monasteries, particularly during the early Middle Ages, were absolute powerhouses of book production. While royal courts and later universities would develop their own scriptoria, it was often the quiet dedication of monastic scribes that preserved classical knowledge and religious texts through turbulent times. These weren't just places of prayer, they were centers of learning, art, and yes, industrial-scale copying operations. Churning out manuscripts, page by painstaking page, it's a mainstream historical fact that without the tireless work in these monastic scriptoria, much of the literature and knowledge from antiquity would simply be lost to us. They were like the ancient world's archiving service, except with more chanting and dramatically less cloud storage. Now, when it comes to the truly fancy manuscripts, the ones commissioned by emperors or destined for royal libraries, the black ink is often just the beginning. There's space left for illustrations, for decorative borders, and most importantly, for illuminated capital letters. Those elaborate, often gilded, initial letters that start a chapter or a paragraph. And for these illuminations, you needed color. Lots of glorious, expensive color. And if you wanted to convey the ultimate status, the ultimate authority, you wanted purple. Not just any purple, but the purple. The kind that hinted at imperial lineage and divine right. Getting your hands on that specific purple ink made from snails, that wasn't a quick trip down to the local medieval staples. Oh no, this was a supply chain problem of epic proportions. The knowledge and the sources for the best snail purple dye were concentrated in specific regions, particularly around the eastern Mediterranean, where the Phoenicians had first perfected its extraction thousands of years earlier. But even after the decline of the great empires that relied on this trade, the demand for the color persisted, albeit on a smaller, incredibly exclusive scale. Historians still argue whether the techniques for creating true Tyrian purple from Murex snails were fully understood or consistently applied by medieval scribes as they were in antiquity. Was it the same vibrant, fade-resistant shade, or was it a somewhat cruder imitation using similar snails but perhaps a less refined process? The recipes that survive are often vague, more like cryptic riddles than precise instructions, leaving much to scholarly debate. It's like trying to follow a cookbook where the ingredients are listed as a handful of shiny rocks, some smelly sea stuff, and let it do its thing in the sun for a bit. Not exactly foolproof. So, as you sit there, quill poised over the parchment, you understand that the materials before you represent not just hours of labor, but potentially vast networks of trade, ancient secrets, and the weird biology of a marine gastropod. The simple act of dipping your quill into a pot of ink connects you to a long, strange history. A history where the most powerful color came from a creature most people probably just wanted to avoid stepping on. And tomorrow, you might start work on a section that requires that extraordinary, costly, and slightly whiffy purple ink. But first, we need to understand where it actually came from. And trust me, that story involves a lot more snails than you might think. It makes you wonder what other bizarre ingredients your everyday items might contain if you trace them back far enough. Maybe your coffee beans were once processed by civets. Oh wait, that's a real thing. Never mind. Back to the snails. You're still there, aren't you? Huddled over that desk, the phantom scent of parchment and potential snail goo filling the air. Let's settle deeper into this medieval workspace. This isn't your brightly lit, ergonomically designed home office, that's for sure. The scriptorium is, by modern standards, incredibly austere, often located in a part of the monastery or palace designed for stability and quiet. It's built of heavy stone, which means it's probably freezing in the winter and maybe only slightly less oppressive in the summer. Heating comes from those central braziers, which also means the air gets thick with smoke. And the light? primarily candlelight or oil lamps when the sun isn't cooperating. Cast dancing shadows that probably play tricks on tired eyes. The light source dictates everything. Your desk is positioned to catch the best angle from the window during the day, or the lamp at night. You lean in, your back curving over the manuscript. The work is slow, repetitive, and physically demanding. Hours blur into a continuous stretch of concentration. You dip the quill, carefully lift it, position the tip, and scritch. Scritch, scritch. Lay down another few words onto the page. It's meditation for some, sheer torment for others. Your body protests this static position. Your shoulders ache, your neck is stiff, and your lower back feels like you've been lifting stones, not just pushing a feather across skin. This, incidentally, is a mainstream historical fact. Scribes often suffered from a litany of physical complaints directly attributable to their work. Eye strain, carpal tunnel-like symptoms, arthritis, and significant back and neck problems. It makes you wonder if medieval health insurance covered parchment posture? Probably not. Look at your tools. The quill, likely from a goose, needs constant maintenance. The tip wears down surprisingly quickly on the rough surface of the parchment. Every so often, you have to stop. Pull out your small, sharp knife, your trusty scalpellum, and carefully trim and reshape the nib. It requires precision. A bad cut means the ink won't flow properly, or the line will be uneven. It's like trying to sharpen a pencil made of bone that keeps getting soggy. The parchment itself is a significant investment. You run your hand over it, it feels organic. Sometimes there are still faint vein patterns visible, or tiny scars from the animal's life. It has a distinct smell, too, a slightly animalistic, leathery scent that, combined with the ink and the beeswax used for ruling lines, creates the unique perfume of the scriptorium. It wasn't just about writing, it was about interacting with a material that had its own history, literally etched into its surface. Mistakes are inevitable. Your hand slips, you misread a word, or you dip your quill too deep and blotch the pristine page. A small error might be carefully scraped away with that same sharp knife. A process that thins the parchment and is always a risk. A big error. Well, you might have to start the entire page over. Imagine doing that after hours of work. It's enough to make you want to write angry notes to yourself. And guess what Scribes totally did? This is a delightful, quirky tidbit about medieval scriptoria. Scribes would often leave comments, doodles, or frustrated remarks in the margins. Sometimes they complained about the cold, or the difficulty of the text, or their aching hands. One famously wrote, "Thank God I am finished at the end of a particularly long manuscript." Another, perhaps less piously, added, "The ink is poor, the parchment is hairy, and I am cold. Thank God for beer." They were relatable, it turns out, just like us, minus the internet and plus a higher likelihood of plague. The atmosphere is generally depicted as one of intense silence and concentration. This is partly due to the nature of the work, which requires focus, and partly due to the monastic setting, where silence could be a spiritual discipline. However, historians still argue whether the scriptorium was truly a place of absolute silence, or if there was some level of quiet chatter, perhaps necessary discussion about the text, or even the practice of reading aloud. Reading aloud was a common way to process and verify text, even when copying, and it's possible a low murmur of voices was a constant, if subdued, backdrop to the scratching quills. The image of total, tomb-like silence might be a bit romanticized. It was probably more like a library study room during finals week. Mostly quiet, but with the occasional cough, sigh, or muttered complaint about the hairy parchment. Think about the sheer volume of work. Before the printing press came along, every single book, every copy of every document had to be written by hand. It was a bottleneck in the spread of information, a task requiring enormous human effort and significant resources. A large Bible could take years to complete and require the skins of hundreds of animals for the parchment. The scribe wasn't just copying words. They were helping to preserve and propagate knowledge in a world where information was a scarce and precious commodity. They were the human photocopiers of the Middle Ages, albeit much slower and prone to adding cat drawings in the margins. Beyond the basic black and brown inks, the array of colors available to a scribe creating an illuminated manuscript was, as we touched on, fascinating and varied. They ground minerals like lapis lazuli for brilliant blues incredibly expensive, like the medieval equivalent of a solid gold stapler, or malachite for greens. They extracted dyes from plants like woad for blue, or saffron for yellow. They used insects like cochineal for vibrant reds. Each color had its own preparation method, its own set of challenges, and its own cost. But none quite carried the mystique, the difficulty of production, or the eye-watering expense of the true purple derived from those special sea snails. That was the color that set the most important manuscripts apart, elevating them beyond mere text into objects of immense beauty and political or religious significance. And to get that color, you had to go on a different kind of journey entirely, one that led not to an oak forest or a mineral deposit, but to the messy, smelly business of the seashore. But before we dive into the snails, let's just appreciate the sheer dedication it took to produce any book in this environment. It makes hitting print feel incredibly unheroic. So, you're settled into the rhythmic scritch of the quill, the quiet hum of the scriptorium, or maybe the debated murmur. Who knows? Surrounded by the smells of parchment and ink. But before we dive into the nitty-gritty of snail guts and purple goo, let's pause and really understand why anyone would go to such extreme, smelly lengths for a color. Why purple? Why was this particular hue so utterly, unequivocally the color? It wasn't just because it was pretty. Though, to be fair, the vibrant, deep, sometimes slightly reddish purple achieved from the murex snail is stunningly beautiful and remarkably fade-resistant. No. Purple's power was entirely tied to its rarity and the sheer difficulty and expense of creating it. Imagine a world where obtaining a particular shade of dye is harder and costlier than buying a supercar is today. That was purple. Specifically, Tyrian purple, or royal purple. The dye derived from those certain types of sea snails found primarily in the Mediterranean. The association of purple with royalty and power goes back millennia, long before the medieval scriptoria were imagining. The Phoenicians, those ancient masters of trade and seafaring, were among the first to truly master the extraction of this dye from the murex snail around the city of Tyre, hence Tyrian purple, which means of Tyre. They built an incredibly lucrative trade around it, selling bolts of intensely purple cloth for astronomical prices across the ancient world. If you saw someone wearing Tyrian purple, you knew they were either incredibly wealthy or incredibly powerful. Usually both. It was the ultimate ancient flex, like wearing a watch that costs more than a house. But for your toga, this status symbol carried directly into the Roman Empire. As Rome grew in power, so too did the symbolic importance of purple. It became more than just a sign of wealth. It became the color of the emperor himself. Wearing a toga bordered with Tyrian purple, the toga praetexta was initially a mark of senators and high magistrates, a sign of their authority. But wearing a solid purple toga, the toga picta, eventually became reserved almost exclusively for triumphant generals and, ultimately, the emperors. This is a mainstream historical fact. Roman emperors, starting perhaps most famously with Augustus, heavily controlled the use of Tyrian purple, making it an imperial monopoly. Laws were enacted to prevent anyone outside the ruling family or highest echelons of power from wearing it. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about visual control, reinforcing the social and political hierarchy with color. These laws were known as sumptuary laws, regulations that governed who could wear what, eat what, or own what, based on their social rank. And the laws surrounding purple were particularly strict. The specific shade and the amount of purple one was allowed to use could even denote subtle differences in status among the elite. As a quirky historical tidbit, violating these sumptuary laws regarding purple could result in severe penalties, including heavy fines, confiscation of property, and in extreme cases, even execution. Imagine being put to death because your tunic was too purple. It seems ludicrous to us now, but in a society where color was code, wearing the wrong shade wasn't just a fashion faux pas, it was an act of political defiance. Oh, you like my new cloak? It's to die for, literally? This intense symbolism wasn't just a pagan Roman thing, it transitioned seamlessly into the Christian world. When the Roman Empire shifted its capital eastward to Constantinople and became the Byzantine Empire, purple remained the imperial color. Emperors were born in the purple porphyrogenetos, meaning in a specific purple room in the palace, signifying their legitimate claim to the throne. Icons of Christ and the Virgin Mary were often depicted wearing purple or cloaks lined with purple, linking the color to divine royalty and the heavenly realm. As the focus of power shifted westward again during the early Middle Ages, the association of purple with royalty, nobility, and high ecclesiastical office persisted. Kings and emperors in the fragmented kingdoms of Europe might not always have had direct access to true Tyrian purple from the distant Mediterranean, but the idea of purple, its symbolic weight, remained. Alternative sources for purple dyes were sought. Lichen, plants like madder mixed with blue dyes, but none could truly replicate the depth, richness, and permanence of the murex-based color. These imitation purples were used, but the knowledge and legend of the original snail purple, the imperial purple, lingered. This is why, when you were illuminating a truly significant manuscript back in that scriptorium, especially one destined for a royal court or cathedral treasury, purple was the ultimate color choice. It wasn't just decoration, it was conveying a message. A manuscript written or illuminated with purple ink or pigments was instantly elevated. It wasn't just a book, it was a sacred object, a symbol of the power and legitimacy of the person who commissioned or owned it. Think of the famous Vienna Genesis or the Rossano Gospels, late antique manuscripts written on purple-dyed parchment with silver and gold ink, a precursor to the use of purple ink in later manuscripts. These were prestige items beyond measure. Historians still argue whether the precise symbolic meanings and distinctions between shades of purple were maintained as strictly in the medieval West as they were in the Byzantine Empire or ancient Rome. Did a lighter shade mean lower status, or was any shade of snail purple simply understood as belonging to the elite? The scarcity of the material meant its very presence was the primary signifier, perhaps more so than the specific hue. It's an open scholarly debate. Did the nuances of purple semiotics survive the fall of empires and the passage of centuries? Or did the color simply retain a broader, less codified association with generalized power and wealth? We may never know the full, subtle language that medieval eyes read in those vibrant, purple illuminated letters. But what is certain is that this color held an almost mystical authority, an authority so profound that people were willing to engage in some seriously strange practices to get it. Which, conveniently, brings us back to our slow-moving, purple-bleeding friends. So, we know why purple was the king of colors, the ultimate status symbol that demanded bizarre sourcing methods. But illuminated manuscripts weren't just purple splashes on parchment. They were explosions of color, vibrant reds, deep blues, rich greens, shimmering golds. Where did all these other hues come from? Well, your medieval scribe, or more likely, the specialists attached to the scriptorium, were essentially artisanal chemists and foraging experts, turning everything from dirt and rocks to flowers and bugs into usable pigment and ink. The palette available to a medieval illuminator came almost exclusively from the natural world. You weren't mixing chemicals in a lab coat. You were grinding minerals with a mortar and pestle, boiling plants in pots, or collecting the excretions of unfortunate insects. Reds, for instance, could come from mineral sources like red ochre, basically a fancy clay, or cinnabar, a mineral containing mercury. Cinnabar produced a brilliant scarlet, but it was a pain to grind and, as it turns out, contained mercury sulfate, making it a rather toxic substance to work with day in and day out. Alternatively, you could get reds from insects, particularly kermes, tiny scale insects that live on oak trees. You'd collect them, dry them, and grind them into a paste. It sounds gross, but it gave a lovely deep crimson. It's the medieval equivalent of saying your lipstick is made from beetles, which, in fairness, some modern red dyes still are. Blues were another essential, often costly color. The most prized blue ultramarine came from grinding the semi-precious stone lapis lazuli. Sourcing this stone meant long-distance trade routes, usually from mines in what is now Afghanistan. Preparing it involved a complex, multi-stage process of grinding, washing, and separating the pigment from impurities using wax or resin, which was incredibly labor-intensive and yielded very little usable pigment. This made true ultramarine eye-wateringly expensive, often more costly weight for weight than gold. If lapis was out of your budget, which it probably was unless you were illuminating a book for a king or the pope, you'd turn to plant-based blues like woad or indigo. These were more accessible and they derived from fermenting plant matter, but often less vibrant and more prone to fading over time than the mineral blues. It was the difference between buying designer paint and using berry juice from your garden. Greens came from minerals like malachite, a copper carbonate that gives a beautiful earthy green when ground. Or you could get greens from plants, often by mixing blue and yellow dyes. Another common green, known as verdigris, was actually made by deliberately corroding copper. And this brings us to a particularly quirky tidbit of medieval color production. To make verdigris, artisans would often hang strips of copper over containers of hot vinegar or even urine. The acid fumes would react with the copper, forming a green crust that could then be scraped off, ground, and used as pigment. Yes, your beautiful green illuminated letter might owe its existence to a pot of medieval pea. Gives new meaning to the phrase artist's medium, doesn't it? Yellows were a bit easier to come by, often sourced from plants like saffron expensive because saffron is always expensive. Weld, or turmeric. There was also a mineral yellow called orpiment, a sulfide of arsenic. It made a loveliest bright yellow, but like cinnabar, it was highly toxic due to the arsenic. So you had scribes potentially breathing in mercury and arsenic fumes while trying to create beautiful art. It's a mainstream historical fact that many of the pigments used by medieval artists and scribes, especially those derived from minerals like lead-white lead carbonate, orpiment arsenic sulfide, and cinnabar mercury sulfide, were highly toxic. Working with them day after day, grinding the powders, mixing the paints, would have exposed them to serious health risks. It makes you appreciate that warning label on modern paint cans a little more, though perhaps a medieval warning might have just read, "may cause colorful death." Black ink, as we mentioned, was often made from carbon soot or charcoal mixed with a binder, or from the reaction of gallnuts and iron salts, creating an iron gall ink that turned darker over time, sometimes even eating into the parchment. Whites usually came from lead white, which, you guessed it, is toxic, or from calcium carbonate like chalk or crushed bones. All these pigments, whether mineral, plant, or insect-based, needed to be processed. Minerals had to be cleaned and ground to an incredibly fine powder. The coarser the grind, the duller the color. Plant and insect dyes needed to be extracted through boiling, fermenting, or soaking, and then they had to be mixed with a binder to make them stick to the parchment. Common binders included egg white, often just the albumin, called glaire, animal glue made from boiling scraps of hide, or gum arabic. The precise ratio of pigment to binder and the exact method of preparation would affect the final color and how it applied to the page. Historians still argue about the exact recipes and techniques used for many of these medieval colors. Surviving medieval recipe books, known as coloria or treatises on painting, are often maddeningly vague, describing processes with phrases like "take a sufficient amount" or "grind until it is good." They rarely give precise measurements or temperatures. This makes it an open scholarly debate as to how consistently certain colors were produced, how much variation existed regionally, and how effectively artisans understood the underlying chemistry, which, of course, they didn't understand in a modern scientific sense. Replicating these colors today is a challenge for conservation scientists, who find that even seemingly simple recipes produce variations depending on the source of the raw materials and slight differences in method. It's like trying to bake a medieval cake using a recipe that just says, mix flour, sweetness, and flavor until it tastes good. So, while the medieval scriptorium was alive with a spectrum of colors derived from the earth, plants, and creepy crawlies, purple held a unique place. The effort required for purple, the specific, sometimes grotesque process involving sea snails, and its ancient, unbroken link to imperial power set it apart from the earthy blues, greens, and reds. It was the color you reached for when you wanted your manuscript to shout importance, and maybe whisper, smells a bit. All right, put aside the colorful powders and smelly plant concoctions for a moment. We've explored the scriptorium, appreciated purple's lofty status, and seen the range of other natural colors available. Now, let's meet the unassuming, slow-moving stars of our story, the snails themselves. These aren't just any garden variety snails you might find munching your lettuce, though. Fun fact, some land snails produce a different type of slime, sometimes used in cosmetics today. The circle of weirdness continues. No, these are specific marine gastropods from the Murex family, spiky-shelled residents of the rocky coasts and shallow waters of the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic coast reaching towards Morocco and Portugal. Think of them as small, spiny castles creeping along the seabed or clinging to rocks. Their shells aren't smooth and elegant like some sea snails. They are often rough, knotted, or covered in sharp spines, presumably for protection. There are several species within the Murex family, but the primary ones known historically for yielding the sought-after purple dye are Hexaplex trunculus, sometimes called the band dye murex, Balinus brendaris, the spiny dye murex, and Stramonita hemastoma, the red-mouthed rock shell. Don't worry, you won't be tested on the Latin names, but it's worth noting that these seemingly unremarkable creatures, often just a few centimeters long, held the secret to vast fortunes and imperial power within their humble bodies. Now, where exactly does this magical purple stuff come from? Not from their foot. Thankfully, though snail slime is a thing people are interested in these days for other reasons. The dye precursor is contained within a specific organ called the hypobranchial gland. This gland is located within the snail's mantle cavity, tucked away near its respiratory organs. It's a mainstream historical fact that the source of the famous Tyrian purple dye is the secretion of the hypobranchial gland of certain species of marine gastropods, particularly murex snails. So, when we talk about snail purple, we're really talking about snail gland juice. Appetizing, right? Here's where it gets really interesting, bordering on alchemical magic from a pre-scientific perspective. The fluid produced by the hypobranchial gland isn't purple when it's inside the living snail or when it's freshly extracted. Depending on the species of snail and maybe even its diet, the secretion is initially a milky white, yellowish, or sometimes greenish fluid. The transformation into purple happens only upon exposure to air and light, specifically sunlight. This is a rather quirky tidbit. The substance that becomes royal purple starts its life as a colorless or pale fluid, undergoing a dramatic chemical reaction involving enzymes, oxygen, and UV light to develop its intense hue. Imagine collecting what looks like snail snot and watching it slowly bloom into the color of emperors just by sitting in the sun. It must have seemed like pure sorcery the first time someone observed it intentionally. Look, I put the snail juice out, and now it's purple clearly. I am favored by the sun gods, or possibly just weirdly good at messing with shellfish. The biological purpose of this gland and its secretion in the snail's natural life isn't fully understood, and this remains an open scholarly debate. Why would a snail evolve a gland that produces a substance that turns a brilliant, conspicuous color when exposed to air and light? One theory is that the secretion is part of the snail's predatory strategy. Some murex species are predators that drill into other shellfish, and the secretion might help incapacitate their prey. Another possibility is that it acts as a defense mechanism, either tasting foul or disorienting to potential predators. It might even be an antimicrobial agent to protect the snail from infection. Is the purple color a byproduct of its true function? Or does the coloration itself serve a purpose we haven't figured out? Perhaps related to mating or communication in a way invisible to our eyes. Scientists are still trying to definitively answer why the snails make this stuff in the first place, independent of human dye making. Regardless of its original purpose, humans thousands of years ago discovered its potential for color. And while the medieval scribes might not have been the primary harvesters themselves, that was a specialized, often coastal trade. The demand from places like Scriptoria drove the continued, albeit limited in production and trade of this precious substance. You can picture the scene traders arriving, perhaps by ship, with small, valuable quantities of the prepared dye or even live snails, a whiff of the sea and something else less pleasant accompanying their precious cargo. These snails weren't fast breeders, and harvesting them on a large scale was difficult and labor-intensive. We'll get into the specifics of the harvesting and extraction process later, but just know that collecting enough snails to produce a significant amount of dye was a monumental task. Each snail yielded only a tiny droplet of the crucial fluid. We're talking milligrams, not grams. This inherent scarcity, tied directly to the slow biology of the murex snail and the difficulty of gathering large numbers of them, was the fundamental reason why purple was so expensive and so restricted to the elite. You couldn't just grow more purple in a field like woad or madder. You had to convince thousands upon thousands of little sea snails to donate their bodily fluids. It makes you look at a snail trail on the pavement a little differently, doesn't it? Though, alas, common garden snails are not the ones holding the purple secret. That would make medieval manuscript illumination much easier, and probably smell a lot less fishy. So you know our little spiky-shelled friends, the murex snails, are the source of the purple magic. But how exactly did you get them from clinging to a rock in the sea to sitting on a scribe's desk as precious ink? This wasn't like picking berries off a bush. This was a whole operation. A hunt for purple gold that took place not in quiet scriptoria or stately palaces, but out on the messy, wind-whipped coasts of the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Imagine yourself wading into the cool, sometimes chilly, waters of a bay known for its murex population. The seabed might be rocky, slippery with seaweed, or soft with sand. The water is clear enough to see the bottom in the shallows, revealing clusters of these spiny snails clinging tenaciously to submerged rocks or nestled in crevices. Collection methods varied over time and place, but the core task remained the same: gather the snails. In shallower water, you might simply wade out and pick them up by hand, filling baskets or sacks. Further out, you might use long poles with scoops or nets to dislodge them. In slightly deeper areas, divers, holding their breath, would descend to pry them off rocks. It was manual, physically demanding work, done by specialized coastal communities whose lives were tied to the sea and its less than glamorous bounty. One common method, dating back to antiquity, involved using baited traps. Since murex snails are predatory scavengers, attracted to dead flesh, collectors would lower baskets or nets containing pieces of dead fish or other meat. The snails would crawl in to feed, and the traps could then be hauled up, full of purple potential. It's like snail fishing, but the prize is ink, not dinner. Although, apparently, the snail meat was sometimes eaten after the dye gland was removed. Waste not, want not, I suppose, though I can't imagine it was a particularly sought-after delicacy. Tonight's special boiled snail guts, dye gland removed, comes with a side of suspiciously purple-tinged beans. The scale of this operation is what really highlights the value of the dye. Each snail, remember, yields only a tiny, tiny amount of the precious fluid from its hypobranchial gland. We're talking a mere fraction of a drop per snail. To produce even a small amount of usable dye or pigment, you needed vast numbers of mollusks. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence suggest that hundreds of thousands, even millions of snails were required to create just a few ounces of the concentrated dye. Imagine gathering enough snails to fill a small boat, Knowing that all that effort might only yield enough purple to illuminate a single important manuscript, it puts the concept of effort to reward ratio into truly stark and slightly depressing perspective. It makes picking up pennies off the sidewalk feel like a high yield investment strategy. And all this harvesting happened, understandably, near the coast where the snails lived. These processing sites, where the collected snails were taken to extract the dye, were notorious. The process, as we'll discuss, involved crushing or opening the snails and often letting the glands sit and react. This generated a powerfully foul smell. Ancient writers complained about it, and archaeological sites of murex dye production are often identifiable today by the lingering chemical scent and, more visibly, by enormous mounds of discarded shells. This is a rather quirky tidbit. Some ancient murex dye production sites are marked by vast refuse piles, veritable mountains of discarded snail shells that accumulated over centuries of production. These mounds, like the one at the ancient Phoenician city of Sidon, are potent physical reminders of the industrial scale and messy reality behind the luxury color. They are basically historical landfills dedicated entirely to snail shells. You could say they were literally sitting on piles of money. If money smelled awful and was made of calcium carbonate, it is a mainstream historical fact that large-scale murex harvesting and dye production operations existed throughout the ancient Mediterranean and persisted, though perhaps less centrally organized and on a smaller scale, into the Byzantine period and in areas that continued to value the dye in the early Middle Ages. These weren't just opportunistic beachcombers. These were established industries, often controlled by rulers or wealthy merchants. The sheer volume of snails harvested over centuries brings up an interesting question, and it's one that remains an open scholarly debate: the sustainability of these ancient and medieval harvesting practices. Did they deplete local snail populations? Were certain species driven to the brink of extinction in the most heavily harvested areas? While murex snails are still found in the Mediterranean today, their populations are not what they once were in ancient times, particularly in areas historically famous for purple production like the coasts of Phoenicia, Crete, or parts of Greece. It's debated whether this decline is solely due to historical overharvesting, or if other factors like changes in the marine environment, pollution including from the dye production itself, or later fishing practices also played significant roles. Did the desire for purple permanently alter the coastal ecosystems? It's a weighty thought to attach to a tiny sea snail. So, the next time you see that rich, deep purple in a museum exhibit, maybe on a piece of ancient cloth or in a medieval manuscript, take a moment to appreciate the journey it took, from a spiny snail clinging to a Mediterranean rock, collected by hand or trap, amidst the probable stench of decaying shellfish, all for a minuscule droplet of clear fluid with the potential to become the color of kings. It makes the simple act of acquiring paint today feel rather anticlimactic. Oh, I just popped to the art store. No waiting required. Zero decaying marine life involved. So you've got your baskets, maybe sacks, full of freshly harvested murex snails. They're probably crawling around slowly, blissfully unaware of their destiny as imperial ink. Now comes the crucial step, getting that tiny bit of purple potential out of them. This stage moves from the salty air of the coast to a processing area that, frankly, probably smelled even worse than the shell mounds we just talked about. Historically, there seem to have been two main approaches to getting at that precious hypobranchial gland. The quicker, rougher method involved simply crushing the whole snail, shell and all. You'd dump a bunch of snails into a mortar or a vat and just mash them up. This was faster, especially when dealing with huge quantities, but it meant you got a lot of shell fragments, snail guts, and other unwanted bits mixed in with the gland and its fluid. This would likely result in a lower quality dye, perhaps less vibrant or with more impurities. It also, predictably, created an unimaginable stench as all that organic matter began to decompose. Imagine the smell of a fish market on a hot day, times about 1,000 plus crushing noises. Delightful. The more refined, and likely the method preferred for producing the highest quality dye suitable for luxury items like manuscript ink involved carefully extracting just the gland. This was far more labor-intensive. You or the artisan specializing in this part of the process would take each snail, one by one, and carefully crack or break the shell just enough to access the mantle cavity and locate the small, pale hypobranchial gland. It's described as being a creamy white or yellowish organ, usually visible once the shell is opened in the right place. Using a small hook or a sharp tool, you'd then carefully scoop or lift out this tiny gland. Think about doing that thousands of times. Your fingers would ache, your eyes would strain, and the smell. Oh, the smell would be ever present. Even without crushing the whole snail, accessing and removing the gland from a recently deceased mollusk isn't exactly a perfume counter experience. The glands themselves, once removed, would be gathered in containers. Now, here's a crucial bit, and it leads to a mainstream historical fact. The dye precursors within the hypobranchial gland begin to degrade fairly quickly after the snail dies. To get the best yield and the most vibrant color, the glands needed to be processed relatively rapidly after harvesting. This wasn't something you could just collect on Monday and get around to on Friday. This added a layer of urgency to the already unpleasant task. It was a race against decay, a fight to extract the valuable fluid before the chemistry went south. It's like trying to get all the ingredients for a complicated recipe assembled before the first one you chopped goes bad. But imagine the ingredients are tiny, smelly organs from sea creatures. This need for speed highlights a quirky tidbit. The active compounds in the gland, the ones that turn purple, are sensitive. Once the snail is out of its environment, and certainly once the gland is exposed, enzymes and other biological processes start breaking down the complex organic molecules. The clock is ticking from the moment the snail is collected, making efficient processing absolutely critical for a successful dye batch. Delay meant degraded precursors, weaker color, and wasted effort. It's like trying to keep ice cream frozen on a hot day without a freezer, except the ice cream is valuable snail slime, and when it melts, it smells terrible and doesn't turn purple anymore. The difference between the crude crushing method and the more careful gland extraction also feeds into an open scholarly debate. Was the reputation for varying shades and qualities of Tyrian purple over history partly due to inconsistencies in this initial processing step? Historians and chemists still argue about how much the freshness of the glands, the method of extraction crushing versus careful removal, and the immediate subsequent handling influenced the final hue, intensity, and light fastness of the dye. Did some artisans have closely guarded secrets about gland preparation that resulted in superior purple? Or was it simply a matter of scale and whether you could afford the labor for careful extraction versus mass crushing? The precision, or lack thereof, at this seemingly simple stage had significant ripple effects down the line. Once extracted, the glands or the crushed snail mass, containing the milky or yellowish fluid, were ready for the next, truly transformative stage. This is where the magic and a significant part of the smell really happened. But for now, picture the scene: piles of discarded shells, vats holding small, pale glands or perhaps a gruesome mash, and the air thick with an organic, pungent aroma that spoke of industry, luxury, and countless sacrificed snails. It wasn't a job for the faint of heart or the sensitive of nose. But for the promise of that ultimate color, people endured. So you've got your tiny, pale snail glands, or maybe just a big vat of crushed snail goo, gathered from the coast and brought to the processing area. Now comes the part that, to ancient and medieval eyes, must have seemed like actual magic, albeit very smelly magic. This is where the color appears. The process involves taking those glands or the snail mash and placing them in vats, often ceramic or stone, usually with some salt water or the liquid from the crushed snails themselves. These vats were then exposed to sunlight and air, and this is where the transformation happens. The initially pale or yellowish fluid from the gland isn't the dye itself. It contains precursor compounds. When these compounds interact with oxygen from the air and are exposed to ultraviolet radiation from the sun, they undergo a series of complex chemical reactions. You'd watch as the mixture in the vat began to change color. Over a period of hours, perhaps a few days depending on the light intensity, temperature, and concentration, it would move through a spectrum of hues. First, it might turn yellowish, then greenish, perhaps passing through shades of blue and red before finally settling on a rich, deep, stable purple. This color change sequence is a mainstream historical fact. The formation of the purple dye from the murex gland is a photochemical reaction that progresses through a predictable series of colors upon exposure to sunlight and air. It's like watching a sunrise in reverse, but starting with pale goo. Starting with. Now, let's talk about the smell. Oh, the smell. This stage of the process was infamous. The chemical reactions involved in forming the dye-release volatile compounds, particularly sulfur-containing ones. This gives off an incredibly strong, pervasive, and universally disliked odor. Think rotten eggs, but somehow worse. Maybe with an added hint of old fish and regret. This is a rather pungent, quirky tidbit. The processing of Murex snails for dye production released such foul, sulfurous odors that dye workshops were often located far downwind of populated areas. Their stench a well-known characteristic of coastal dye towns. Imagine working there all day. You'd probably be immune to bad smells forever. But maybe not in a good way. People likely gave you a wide berth, which I suppose could be a medieval form of social distancing. The resulting purple compound, known chemically as 6C6-dibromoindigo, is remarkably light-fast and wash-fast, meaning it resists fading when exposed to light or water. This stability was part of why the dye was so prized. Purple textiles and inks wouldn't just lose their color like many plant-based dyes could. You were creating a color that would last, a permanent symbol of status. The artisans overseeing this process weren't just leaving it to chance. Their skill lay in managing the reaction. The temperature of the vats, the amount of sunlight exposure, the concentration of the fluid. These were all variables that could affect the final shade and quality of the purple. Getting a specific hue, perhaps a reddish purple versus a bluer one, might depend on stopping the reaction at just the right moment or altering the conditions slightly. This leads to an open scholarly debate, the precise techniques, timing, and environmental controls used by ancient and medieval dye masters to achieve consistent results or specific shades are not fully understood. Surviving recipes are often vague, lacking the kind of detail that would allow modern chemists to perfectly replicate every historical hue. Was their secret knowledge passed down through generations, or was it mostly a matter of experienced judgment? An intuitive understanding of the process gained through years of smelly practice. We're still figuring out the exact secret sauce beyond the snail goo itself. The vats would sit there, baking in the sun, emitting their terrible smell, slowly turning a vibrant purple. Flies were probably a nightmare. Seagulls, however, might have given the place a wide berth, which is saying something. Once the desired color intensity was reached and the reaction was complete, the resulting purple substance would be separated from the remaining biological debris. This might involve washing, filtering, or allowing the pigment to settle. What you were left with was either a concentrated dye liquor, ready for dyeing textiles, or a purple sediment that could be dried and prepared as a pigment for paints and inks. It's hard to overstate how revolutionary this process must have seemed when first discovered. Taking a seemingly ordinary sea creature, accessing a hidden part of its anatomy, and, through the action of sunlight and air, coaxing forth a color of unparalleled richness and permanence. It's a testament to ancient observation and experimentation, a willingness to engage with the messy, smelly, and sometimes dangerous aspects of the natural world to create something beautiful and valuable. Just imagine pitching this idea to someone today. Okay, so step 1. We need about 1 million snails. They'd probably just buy a printer. And honestly, after describing this process, I can't blame them. All right, the vats have sat in the sun. The chemical transformation and the worst of the smell, hopefully, is complete. and you're left with a dark, rich purple substance, perhaps settled at the bottom of the container or clinging to the processed glands. But this raw material isn't quite ready for your quill yet. This is where the output from the dye workshop makes its way towards the scriptorium, transitioning from a potential textile dye into a pigment ready to be made into glorious, if expensive, ink. There's a key difference between a dye and a pigment. A dye is typically a substance that dissolves in a liquid and chemically bonds with the material being colored like fabric. A pigment, on the other hand, consists of fine, insoluble particles that are suspended in a liquid binder and adhere to the surface they're applied to like parchment. The purple compound from the murex snail could be used as both, but for manuscript illumination and ink, it was primarily used as a pigment. So the purple stuff from the vats needed further processing. Any remaining biological debris from the snails had to be carefully removed. The purple solid would be separated from the liquid, washed to remove impurities, and then dried. Once dry, you'd be left with brittle chunks or flakes of the deep purple pigment. But even that wasn't enough. For this pigment to flow smoothly from a quill and create clean lines or even washes of color, it needed to be ground into an incredibly fine powder. This was another labor-intensive step, often done by hand using a mortar and pestle, sometimes on a grinding slab. Imagine standing there, patiently grinding tiny amounts of hard, purple material into a powder as fine as flour, or even finer. The goal was to break down all the pigment particles so they were evenly sized and suspended easily in the binder without clumping or scratching the delicate parchment surface. The quality of the grinding directly impacted the quality of the final ink. A poorly ground pigment would result in gritty ink that clogged the quill nib and produced uneven color. It's like trying to make smooth paint out of little pebbles. Takes a while. Maybe put on some medieval ASMR grinding sounds. Once you had your incredibly fine purple powder, and remember how many snails it took to get even a small pile of this stuff? It needed to be mixed with a binder to turn it into usable ink or paint. Pigments are just color particles. Without a binder, they just sit on the surface and brush right off. The binder holds the pigment together and glues it to the parchment. This is a mainstream historical fact. Pigments for illumination, including precious ones like snail purple and lapis lazuli, were typically mixed with binders such as egg white glare or gum arabic to create workable paints or inks. The choice and preparation of the binder were critical. Egg white, specifically the albumen, was a very common binder for manuscript illumination, known as glare. Preparing glare was a process in itself. You'd separate the egg white, then often whisk it vigorously until it was a frothy mess. Then, and here's a slightly quirky tidbit, you'd let it stand for a day or two, sometimes adding a little wine or vinegar, during which time the froth would separate, and the liquid glare underneath would become clearer and more fluid. The froth was discarded and the clear liquid used. Some recipes even suggested letting it ferment slightly to improve its properties. So, your fancy purple ink might be held together by carefully aged, slightly fermented egg white. Delicious. Other binders included gum arabic, a resin from acacia trees dissolved in water, or animal glue made from boiling down scraps of hides or bones. To make the purple ink, you would take a small amount of the fine purple pigment powder and mix it with your chosen binder, gradually adding water or liquid until you achieve the desired consistency. For drawing fine lines or writing text, you'd want a thinner, more ink-like consistency. For painting larger areas or initial letters, you might want a thicker, more paint-like mixture. Getting the ratio just right was key. Too much binder and the ink might be glossy and crack. Too little and it would be powdery and rub off. Additives might also be included. A touch of honey could help keep the ink moist on the nib. A tiny amount of gall ink, the standard black ink, might be added to subtly alter the shade of purple or make it flow better, though this would change the chemical composition. The medieval recipes that survive offering guidance on these mixtures are often frustratingly imprecise, which leads to an open scholarly debate. The exact proportions of pigment, binder, and liquid, as well as the potential use of other additives in medieval snail purple ink, are not clearly documented. making the precise replication of historical ink formulations challenging for modern researchers. Was there a standard recipe for royal purple ink? Or did every scriptorium or every ink maker have their own slightly different method? It's hard to say definitively, but once the grinding was done, the glare was prepared, and the mixing was complete. You finally had a small pot of deep, vibrant purple ink. This was the culmination of that long, smelly journey from the sea. It was ready to be dipped into by a quill, ready to be carefully applied to the expensive parchment, ready to bring a touch of imperial luxury and divine authority to a manuscript page. It makes you appreciate the effort behind every single purple flourish you see in those old books. It wasn't just drawing, it was applying liquid history, bound with egg white. So you've seen the entire peculiar process, from wading into the sea to coaxing color out of snail glands in the sun, and finally grinding it all into fine purple powder mixed with egg white. Now you have a small pot of this incredible purple ink sitting on your scribe's desk. But let's be clear, getting to this point was fraught with challenges. Making snail purple ink wasn't just a little bit difficult, it was monumentally tricky, hugely labor-intensive, and eye-wateringly expensive. Let's break down the sheer mountain of difficulties involved. First, there's the supply issue. You couldn't farm these snails like sheep or grow them like flax, at least not effectively with medieval technology. You had to find and harvest them from the wild, remember Section 6. This required access to specific coastal areas, navigating tides and weather, and engaging in demanding physical labor, either wading, diving, or managing traps. The snails are slow-moving, but finding them in the numbers required was no small feat. Then there's the yield problem. As we discussed back in Section 5, each individual snail, after all that effort to collect it, produces only a minuscule amount of the dye precursor. We're talking fractions of a drop. This meant you needed staggering numbers of snails, hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million for just a pound of dye. Imagine the logistics of gathering that many tiny creatures, transporting them, and keeping them viable until processing. It's an efficiency nightmare by modern standards. Your per snail return on investment was absolutely microscopic. It makes collecting spare change seem like a get-rich-quick scheme. The processing itself presented its own set of hurdles. The careful extraction of the gland from Section 7 was meticulous. Repetitive work requiring skill and patience. The cruder crushing method was faster but resulted in lower quality and a higher snail-to-dye ratio needed. Regardless of method, you were in a race against time. Remember that quirky tidbit from Section 7 about the race against decay? The glands had to be processed quickly before the crucial precursors degraded. And we absolutely have to talk about the smell again. We smelled it back in Section 8. The processing sites were notorious for their overpowering, sulfurous stench. Working in that environment day after day, being constantly surrounded by the smell of reacting snail compounds, would have been physically unpleasant and socially isolating. It wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a significant occupational hazard, if unpleasant smells count as hazards, which I think they should. My kingdom for a medieval air freshener. Getting the chemical reaction right in the vats. That sun, air, and stink magic from Section 8 added another layer of complexity. You had to judge the exposure to sun and air to achieve the desired color. Too little sun, too little air, the wrong temperature, and the reaction might not complete properly, yielding a poor color or no color at all. Too much, and you might overshoot the perfect purple, potentially ending up with a different shade or damaging the pigment. Controlling these variables without precise instruments or a scientific understanding of the chemistry required immense experience and skill, and even then, batches could fail. All these factors, the difficult sourcing, the low yield, the intense labor, the unpleasant conditions, the technical challenges of processing, combined to create the single biggest challenge: the cost. Snail purple dye, and consequently the pigment derived from it for ink, was astonishingly expensive. This is a mainstream historical fact. Tyrian purple was historically one of the most expensive substances by weight in the ancient and medieval world, often worth more than its weight in gold. Yes, you heard that right. As a quirky tidbit, at various points in history, high-quality Murex purple pigment was literally more valuable, gram for gram, than gold. Imagine carrying around a small pouch of purple powder, knowing it was worth more than a comparable pouch of precious metal. It wasn't just rich people who could afford purple, it was exceptionally rich people. This astronomical cost wasn't just due to production, it was also due to trade. The prime Murex-producing regions were in the Mediterranean, far from many of the major centers of power and learning in Northern Europe, where illuminated manuscripts were being produced during parts of the Middle Ages. The raw material or the processed pigment had to be transported across vast distances, often by sea, which added further cost, risk of loss, piracy, storms, and complexity to the supply chain. The economics of this industry are fascinating, and they lead to an open scholarly debate. The exact economic structures and trade networks specifically dedicated to the Murex purple industry throughout different periods are not fully clear. Who controlled the supply? Were there specific merchant families or guilds that dominated the trade? How did the political landscape empires rising and falling? Trade routes shifting impact. The availability and cost of purple in different regions over time. Understanding the business side of snail slime sheds light on why purple manuscripts are relatively rare compared to those made with more common inks and pigments. So, when you look at that little pot of purple ink on your scribe's desk, you're not just seeing color, you're seeing the culmination of incredible difficulty, countless hours of smelly labor, thousands of sacrificed snails, complex trade routes, inherent technical challenges, and a final product whose value was literally measured against the most precious metal known to man. It's a reminder that even the most beautiful things often have messy, challenging, and astonishingly expensive origins. And it makes you really appreciate why purple wasn't a color you saw in your average medieval peasant's tunic. Unless they were planning a very short-lived, very bold fashion statement. We've been talking a lot about purple as if it were one single, specific color. But just like today, purple in the ancient and medieval world wasn't a monolithic hue. The incredible dye derived from Murex snails actually yielded a spectrum of related shades, ranging from reddish purples and violets to deep blues and even blackish purples. Tyrian purple was more of a category than a single paint chip on a color chart. Several factors influenced the final shade of the dye and pigment produced. One significant factor was the specific species of Murex snail used. As we briefly touched upon back in Section 5, different species produced different precursor compounds in their glands. For example, Hexaplex trunculus, the band dimurex, primarily yielded a precursor that, when exposed to light, favored the formation of indigotin, the main chemical compound in indigo dye. This often resulted in bluer or violet blue shades. Balanus brandaris, the spiny dimurex, and Stramonida hemastoma, on the other hand, yielded precursors that produced more of the brominated indigo compounds, leading to the classic reddish purple or crimson shades often associated with royal purple. This is a mainstream historical fact. Different species of Murex snails primarily yielded different key dye precursors that resulted in distinct color biases, leaning towards bluer or redder hues depending on the dominant species processed. Think of it like having different types of grapes for wine. They all make wine, but a Cabernet grape gives you a different starting point than a Merlot. Similarly, an ink made predominantly from Hexaplex trunculus might have a bluer undertone, while one from Balanus brandaris would lean redder. Beyond the snail species, the precise methods used in processing also played a crucial role in determining the final color. Remember the photochemical reaction in the vats from Section 8. The timing of that reaction was critical. If the process was stopped earlier, before the full transformation occurred, you could potentially obtain blues, greens from intermediates, or reds depending on the stage. Allowing the reaction to go to completion, often with extended sunlight exposure, typically resulted in the deepest, most prized purples, sometimes so dark they appeared almost black in certain lights. The temperature of the solution and the concentration of the gland material could also subtly influence the outcome. Artisans became skilled through long practice at judging the stages of the color change and manipulating the process to achieve specific desired shades. Sometimes, achieving a particularly rich or complex color involved a double dyeing process, where materials were first treated with dye from one species and then with dye from another, or the same dye processed differently. This layering of color could create incredibly deep and nuanced purples. The ancients certainly recognized these distinctions in shade, and they had different names for them. While Tyrian purple is a broad term, historical sources mention specific shades like porphyra, the general term for purple, hisgonon, a reddish scarlet, sometimes associated with kermes but also certain murex processes, and specific terms for the most prized deep, dark, almost blackish purples. As a quirky tidbit, these historical names for different murex-based shades, like Tyrian scarlet for a reddish variety or imperial blue for a bluer one, indicate that artisans and patrons differentiated and valued a range of colors produced from these snails. Not just one specific purple. It wasn't just get me the snail color. It was get me the snail color that leans a bit more towards a bruised plum, not a twilight sky. This variability in outcome, depending on species and process, leads to an open scholarly debate. How much control did ancient and medieval dyers and pigment makers truly have over achieving a perfectly consistent batch of a specific shade? While they were clearly skilled, were they able to reliably reproduce the same hue time after time? Or was each batch of snail purple a unique creation, with slight variations that patrons simply accepted due to the rarity and value of the color? Was it purely empirical trial and error, refined over generations? Or did they have more systematic, albeit pre-scientific, methods for controlling the chemical reaction? We may never know the full extent of their mastery in coaxing specific shades from these temperamental mollusks. It's like trying to bake the same sourdough loaf every time when your starter has its own personality and the weather is always different. So, when you see that intense purple in a manuscript, remember it might not be the single, idealized Tyrian purple. It could be a bluer shade derived primarily from Hexaplex trunculus, a redder hue from Bolinus brandaris, or a specific point in the photochemical transformation captured by a skilled artisan. It's a color with a complex origin story, and even its final appearance holds clues about the snails used and the hands that coax the pigment from them. It adds another layer of history to every stroke of that expensive, sometimes blue, sometimes red, always difficult to get snail-based ink. It's purple, but with footnotes, and maybe a faint, lingering hint of the sea, if you use your imagination and ignore the smell. So you've got that little pot of precious, painstakingly produced snail purple ink sitting on your desk in the scriptorium. You know how much effort, how many snails, how much time, and frankly, how much money went into creating it. Remember that more expensive than gold quirky tidbit from Section 10. Given all that, you can probably guess this wasn't the ink you used for copying inventories of grain or writing letters to your Aunt Mildred if medieval people had aunts named Mildred, which they probably did. This ink was reserved for something special, something significant. Due to its astronomical cost and the intense labor involved in its production, snail purple ink was used almost exclusively for the highest status documents and manuscripts. We're talking about books and charters commissioned by emperors, kings, popes, and the most powerful members of the nobility and clergy. These weren't books meant for wide circulation or everyday reading. They were objects of power, prestige, and devotion, often kept in treasury libraries or cathedrals. You would find this glorious purple ink used in luxury versions of key religious texts, lavishly illuminated gospels, psalters, and Bibles. It would also appear in important state documents like royal charters, imperial decrees, or treaties. The use of purple ink automatically elevated the status of the document, visually broadcasting the importance of its contents and the authority of the person who commissioned or owned it. Where would you see it on the page? Not typically for the main body of the text. That was usually done in standard black or brown ink. The purple was reserved for highlighting, for emphasis. You might see it used for initial letters. Those large, elaborate, decorative capital letters at the beginning of chapters or paragraphs were prime candidates for purple, often combined with gold leaf or other vibrant colors. Titles and headings. Section titles or the opening words of a significant passage might be written entirely in purple ink. Keywords or phrases. Sometimes, particularly important names like God or the name of the commissioning ruler or significant scriptural passages would be picked out in purple. Decorative elements, borders, frames, or other ornamental elements on the page might incorporate snail purple. Before the widespread use of purple ink on regular parchment, there was an even more extravagant practice, particularly associated with the late Roman and Byzantine empires writing with gold or silver ink on parchment that had been dyed entirely purple. This is a fascinating, quirky tidbit. The practice of creating manuscripts where the entire parchment page was stained a deep purple, and the text was written in shimmering metallic ink made from gold or silver, was a supreme display of wealth and imperial power, predating the use of purple ink on white parchment and influencing its later symbolism. Imagine a book where every single page is purple, and the words literally glitter. It's incredibly opulent. This practice was a direct visual link back to the purple robes of Roman emperors. This leads us to a mainstream historical fact: using purple ink, or writing on purple-dyed parchment, was a practice strongly associated with imperial and royal authority throughout the Roman world, continuing through the Byzantine Empire and influencing the visual language of power adopted by kings and rulers in the early medieval West. It was a deliberate echo of imperial tradition, a way for new rulers to connect themselves visually to the legitimacy and grandeur of the empires that came before. The individuals who commissioned these purple-laden manuscripts were at the very top of the social hierarchy: Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, holy Roman emperors, powerful Frankish kings like Charlemagne and his successors, and influential ecclesiastical figures in major monasteries and cathedrals. Owning a book with snail purple in it was like owning a fleet of private jets today. It wasn't just functional, it was a declaration of immense status and wealth. The specific way purple was used might also have conveyed nuanced meanings, though this is an open scholarly debate. Did the type of purple, the redder or bluer shades we discussed in section 11, the amount used on the page, or the combination of purple with gold or silver, follow a precise code that would have been immediately understood by a medieval elite audience? Or was the symbolism more general, simply that this book is important and belongs to someone powerful? We know purple meant status, but the subtle grammar of its use on the page is still being deciphered by historians. Seeing these surviving manuscripts today, with their vibrant purple initials and titles, is like getting a direct visual message from the past about who and what was considered most important. It's a splash of extreme luxury on pages crafted with immense skill. It makes you wonder if the scribes, carefully applying this ink that was literally worth more than gold, felt the weight of that value on their quills. They were, quite literally, writing with wealth. Probably made them extra careful about spills. Oops, there goes half the king's annual income on the floor. A medieval scribe's version of hitting send all accidentally. We've journeyed from the sea snail to the royal manuscript, tracing the difficult path of purple ink to its place of prestige. But like all empires and exclusive luxury goods, the reign of true Murex purple ink didn't last forever. As the medieval period drew to a close and the world shifted towards the Renaissance and beyond, the reliance on this ancient, costly source of purple began to wane. It wasn't a sudden disappearance, but more of a slow fading of its light. Several factors contributed to this decline. Geopolitical shifts played a significant role. The Byzantine Empire, which had maintained a strong link to the ancient traditions of Murex purple production and held it as a potent symbol of imperial continuity, gradually declined in power over the later Middle Ages. Its eventual fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 was a major blow, This is a mainstream historical fact. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 significantly disrupted established trade routes and had a profound impact on the availability and trade of goods from the Eastern Mediterranean, including traditional luxury items like high-quality Murex purple dye and pigment. With the old imperial power gone and trade patterns fractured, the reliable supply chain for this specific Mediterranean luxury became much harder to maintain for patrons in the West. Simultaneously, alternative sources for purple colors were becoming more prevalent and accessible. While true snail purple offered unmatched vibrancy and light fastness, cheaper imitations and alternative purples filled the gap for those who couldn't afford or couldn't access the genuine article. Plant-based dyes that yielded purple or violet shades became more widely used. One notable alternative came from lichens. Lichen dyes, particularly those yielding purples and violets like orchil or cudbear, became increasingly popular in the later Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. And here's a quirky tidbit. The process for extracting purple dye from these lichens often involved fermentation using ammonia sources, traditionally stale urine. So, the decline of snail purple didn't necessarily mean the end of strangely sourced, slightly smelly purple. It just meant a shift from marine gastropods to symbiotic fungi and algae. With a detour through the latrine, progress debatable from a smell perspective. These lichen-based purples, while generally less brilliant and more prone to fading than Murex purple, were significantly easier and cheaper to produce. You could find the lichens in many different regions, reducing reliance on long-distance trade. Combining readily available red dyes like madder or kermes with blue dyes like woad or indigo also allowed for the creation of various shades of purple and violet, offering more flexibility and lower cost than the snail-based pigment. As time went on, new discoveries further impacted the landscape of color. The arrival of cochineal, a brilliant red insect dye from the Americas, after the Age of Exploration, provided a vibrant alternative for creating reds and when mixed with blues, purples that rivaled or even surpassed the intensity of some traditional sources, and often at a lower cost. Eventually, the development of synthetic dyes in the 19th century made vibrant, stable purple widely and cheaply available for the first time in history, completely revolutionizing the color industry and rendering natural luxury purples, like the Murex-based one, economically obsolete. Changing artistic styles and fashion trends also played a role. While purple retained symbolic importance, the specific visual impact of purple parchment and heavy use of purple ink on manuscripts became less central to the display of power compared to earlier periods. New forms of art, new patronage structures, and new aesthetic preferences emerged. The exact weight given to each of these factors in the decline of true Murex purple use is still an open scholarly debate. Was the collapse of the Byzantine supply chain the primary driver, forcing people to seek alternatives? Or did the increasing availability and improving quality of cheaper plant and lichen-based purples simply make the costly, difficult Murex process economically unsustainable even where the snails were available? Was it a push from the failure of the old system, or a pull from the convenience and cost-effectiveness of the new? It was likely a complex interplay of all these factors, a slow economic and logistical squeeze on the ancient, smelly industry. So, the scriptoria of the later medieval period saw less and less of that incredibly expensive, snail-derived purple ink. Other purples took its place on the page. Still beautiful, but lacking the deep history, the imperial connection, and, frankly, the sheer, ridiculous effort that went into the original. The era of snail-powered luxury ink was slowly, quietly drawing to a close, making those earlier manuscripts with their vibrant Murex purple flourishes all the more precious as relics of a time when a color could be worth more than gold, and came from a creature that just wanted to crawl on a rock. We've traced the story of snail purple from its humble, spiny origin on the seabed, through smelly vats and grinding stones, onto the pages of emperors' books, and witnessed its gradual retreat in the face of changing times and cheaper colors. But even though true Murex purple dye and ink faded from widespread use centuries ago, the echoes of this incredible history still resonate. The legacy of this color and the bizarre, ingenious method of its creation endure, connecting us back to the ancient world and shaping our very perception of the color purple today. Think about the sheer human ingenuity involved. Thousands of years ago, someone, somewhere, observed that a particular little sea snail produced a fluid that changed color in the sun. They experimented. They perfected techniques through trial and error over centuries. They built an entire industry around it, complete with specialized harvesters, processors, and complex trade networks. It was a remarkable technological achievement for its time, turning a seemingly insignificant biological process into a source of immense wealth and power. It's a testament to curiosity and persistence, the kind that makes you poke at something weird just to see what happens, and then turn it into a multi-million dollar, or rather, multi-gold piece industry. The symbolism forged by this difficult origin story stuck, even when the actual snail dye became incredibly rare or unavailable in certain regions. The idea of Tyrian purple as the color of royalty, luxury, and divine authority persisted. Other, less expensive purples might be used on textiles or in art, but they often borrowed their prestige from the legendary status of the original Murex-based color. It's like the idea of a luxury car persisting even if the specific model changes. Purple was the color version of a Rolls-Royce, even if you had to settle for a slightly less posh sedan made from lichens later on. In the modern era, science has confirmed many aspects of this historical process. Chemists have analyzed ancient textile fragments and residues from dye vats and identified the specific chemical compound responsible for the stable purple 6-dibromo indigo. This is a mainstream historical fact. Modern chemical analysis has confirmed that the primary pigment in ancient and medieval Murex purple dye is 6-dibromo indigo, a unique brominated form of indigo not found in plant dyes. This confirmed that the historical accounts of a distinct dye source were accurate and explained its remarkable properties like light fastness. Interestingly, modern attempts by scientists and historical reenactors to replicate the Murex dye process, following ancient descriptions and archaeological evidence, have confirmed just how difficult and unpredictable it could be. They've experienced firsthand the challenges of processing thousands of snails, the critical importance of sunlight and air, the variability in the resulting shades depending on subtle differences in method or snail source, and yes, the smell. This is a rather pungent, quirky tidbit. Modern chemists and historians attempting to recreate Murex purple dye using historical methods have reported experiencing the same intense, unpleasant, sulfurous odors described by ancient writers, confirming that the stink magic was a very real part of the process. Some have even ended up with unexpected greenish or reddish batches, echoing the potential for variability that medieval artisans would have faced. It turns out history doesn't always smell great, even when you're trying to make something beautiful. This enduring connection between purple and power, wealth, and uniqueness continues today. Think about the phrase, born in the purple. It still means someone born into a privileged or royal family. A direct echo of the Byzantine emperors. Remember that callback from Section 3. Purple is still used in ceremonial robes, particularly in academic and some religious contexts. In marketing, purple is often used to convey luxury, creativity, or exclusivity. Even in popular culture, purple is frequently associated with royalty or high status. This persistence of symbolism, tied back to the ancient snail dye, raises an interesting question. And it's an open scholarly debate: to what extent did the legend and historical significance of true Tyrian purple continue to imbue other purple dyes and pigments with a borrowed sense of prestige throughout the medieval period and beyond? Even as the original became scarce, did the myth of the royal snail color sustain purple's status? Or did the increasing use of cheaper alternatives eventually dilute its exclusive meaning? It's hard to disentangle the intrinsic appeal of the color from the powerful history and symbolism created by the Murex dye industry. So, the next time you see the color purple, whether it's in a book, on clothing, or even just a crayon, take a moment to remember the incredible journey of its most famous historical incarnation. Remember the tiny snails, the smelly vats, the patient scribes, and the emperors who demanded the color of kings. It's a reminder that history isn't just about dates and battles, it's also about materials, processes, symbols, and the surprising places people have looked to find beauty and express power. Even, it turns out, inside a sea snail. Who knew well? The Phoenicians knew, and the Romans, and the Byzantines, and a handful of very patient, probably slightly smelly, medieval scribes. And so we've reached the end of our peculiar historical detour. You've journeyed from the quiet, quill-scratching world of the medieval scriptorium back in time to the sun-drenched, smelly coast where tiny snails clung to rocks. You've seen the incredible effort, the bizarre processes, the astronomical cost, and the profound symbolic power packed into that single vibrant color purple. The color that wasn't just painted onto a page, but coaxed from the very life fluid of a sea creature. It's a story filled with unexpected details, isn't it? The sheer number of snails needed? Remember those mountains of shells? The race against decay? The stink magic that turned pale fluid into imperial purple? The painstaking grinding and mixing with things like fermented egg white? And the fact that ounce for ounce that finished pigment could be worth more than gold. It truly puts the phrase liquid assets into historical perspective, doesn't it? The manuscripts adorned with this precious ink weren't just books. They were treasures. They represented immense wealth, political authority, and religious devotion. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval manuscripts, particularly illuminated ones using expensive materials like gold leaf and rare pigments such as Murex purple, were often among the most valuable physical objects owned by individuals. Monasteries or royal courts, they were symbols of status passed down through generations. Artifacts whose material value reinforced the importance of the knowledge and power they contained. Because the ink was so incredibly expensive, every drop mattered. The scribes and the people who managed the scriptoria would have been acutely aware of the cost of the materials. This leads to a rather precise, quirky tidbit due to its extreme value. Purple ink was measured and accounted for with meticulous care in medieval scriptoria and treasuries, sometimes noted in inventories like precious jewels or metals, rather than mere writing supplies. You didn't just order a bottle of purple ink. You might account for it by weight, ensuring not a single speck of the gold-worth pigment was wasted or pilfered. It was treated like a liquid gem. Looking back at the whole process, from coast to codex, there's also a human element that's fascinating, and it presents an open scholarly debate. We have the coastal communities, likely of lower social status, engaging in the backbreaking, smelly work of harvesting and processing the snails. And we have the scribes and illuminators, often monks or highly skilled artisans, working in more sheltered and esteemed environments, who received the final, valuable pigment. How much interaction was there between these two worlds? Did the scribes have any real understanding of the difficult, messy origins of their most prized color? Beyond knowing it came from fish or shells and cost a fortune. And how much did the harvesters know about the beautiful manuscripts their smelly product would eventually adorn? The true level of interaction and knowledge transfer between the Murex harvesters, processors, and the scribes illuminators remains debated. Were they entirely separate worlds connected only by trade? Or was there some understanding or even respect across the different stages of this peculiar industry? Our journey tonight has taken us deep into the unexpected corners of history, revealing the bizarre realities behind familiar concepts like color and books. It reminds us that even the most mundane objects today often have complex, sometimes strange, and always fascinating origin stories if you look closely enough. And it leaves us with the enduring image of that vibrant purple, a color that whispered of emperors and God, and screamed of snails and very, very hard work. Now, as the story winds down, feel yourself slowly drifting away from that medieval scriptorium. The scratching of the quill fades into the quiet background. The smells of parchment and ink soften, becoming less distinct. You can let go of the images of spiky snails and smelly vats. They did their work, and their story is told. Allow your mind to clear, releasing any lingering thoughts or worries. Just focus on the gentle sounds around you. The soft hum of a fan, the distant quiet of the night. Feel the comfort of your bed beneath you, the warmth of your blankets. Your breath is slow and steady. There is nothing more you need to know, nothing more you need to do. The history is complete, the journey finished. All that remains is peace and rest. Sink deeper into your pillow, letting go of any tension. Imagine the color purple now, not as the result of ancient labor, but simply as a calming, gentle hue, washing over you, bringing tranquility. Sleep is here. Sweet dreams.